Words can't explain how it feels to lose a child. When you first give birth and the nurse hands you that little bundle of joy for the first time, you just look down at its innocent eyes and smile. You never think about what would happen if your child were taken from you. The very thought of it sends shockwaves of pain through your body. I still remember the day that we lost Riley. The doctor walked out to the waiting room, a look of absolute defeat on her face. She didn't even have to say anything for me to understand. But when she finally croaked out the first words, "We did everything we could," I absolutely lost it. Riley was born 7 years ago in our small town. He was our first child, and boy did he come fast. I was in labor for a total of 4 hours before he came into this world. But that's how Riley always lived his life. Fast. The very second I laid eyes on him, I knew that I would do absolutely anything to protect him. When Riley was 2, he fell and bumped his head on the coffee table. I was in hysterics as we rushed him to the emergency room, head busted open and bleeding over me. They stitched him up in an hour and told me it was no big deal. I never wanted to feel fear like that again. Any mother will tell you that when something happens to your baby, it's like time stops. Seconds feel like hours. All you can focus on is getting your child help. When Riley was 5, we discovered his peanut allergy. He was in Sunday school, enjoying snack time, when a child beside him opened up a pack of peanut butter crackers. Riley got one whiff and his throat began to close up. My husband and I rushed him to the emergency room, where he was given epinephrine and antihistamines. He was fine to go home the next morning, but the fear in my heart lingered on. I was cautious every single day about what Riley and the people around him ate. It wasn't something I worried about, it was so much more than that. It was something I literally obsessed about. I never wanted to feel that way ever again. As I mentioned before, I would do absolutely anything to protect him. I was at work when I got the call that Riley was having an allergic reaction at school. I yelled instructions about EpiPens over the phone as I ran out to my car. The school nurse already knew what to do, obviously, but I wanted to be absolutely sure. I called my husband on the way to the hospital, and we both met there. When we arrived, we were forced into a waiting room, our son's condition remaining unknown to us. We sat for hours. My anxiety increased and increased as time went on. My husband was always calmer than I in these situations. He kept reassuring me that the school had done everything right, and Riley would be okay. Death from anaphylaxis was rare. Less than 1% of people die from it. I took a few deep breaths and relaxed a bit. He was right. Everything would be fine. That's when the doctor came out and delivered the bad news. I was devastated. I fell to the floor, screaming. People looked at me like I was crazy, but the mothers in the room showed sympathy. They understood the pain I was feeling. We went home in silence. We stayed that way for a few days. Riley's backpack and lunchbox stayed packed in the kitchen. I couldn't bear to touch it. We put our son in the ground later that week. A few days later, my husband returned to work. How did people continue their lives? My world had crumbled apart, and I would never recover. Eventually, Riley's lunchbox began to stink, so I decided that I needed to clean it. Perhaps it would be therapeutic. I was beginning to feel a lot of anger about his death. What idiot had packed peanut butter in their child's lunch? We'd sent out the letters before school started, emails constantly reminding parents about Riley's severe allergies. People just don't give a shit if it isn't their kid, and I knew that. But they took my son away from me with their selfishness. And I was pissed about it. I was just about to grab my laptop and email every goddamn parent in Riley's grade that they were all selfish pricks, when the horrid smell brought me back to reality. I sighed as I unzipped his lunchbox and started pulling out the contents. The carton of chocolate milk was way past rotted. It smelled absolutely horrendous. The chips were soft and mushy as they crumbled in the plastic baggie. Last was Riley's sandwich. There is this wonderful stuff I suggest for family and friends of peanut allergy sufferers. It's called Wow Butter. It is made from soy, and while there isn't an exact replica of true peanut butter, it's pretty damn close. Slap it on a sandwich with some jelly and you'd never know the difference, other than the smell being slightly different. The bread was molded and the jelly was oozing out the sides. A small bite was taken out of the sandwich. It must have been the only thing he was able to eat before he had his reaction. As I was throwing his lunch in the outside bin, since it was far too rancid to be inside, I caught a whiff of something. It was something that I hadn't smelled in the 2 years since we found out about Riley's allergy. Peanut butter. I immediately looked in the bin for anything, but it was empty, save for the contents of his lunch I'd just thrown in there. I slowly reached down, picking up the moldy sandwich. I held it to my nose and sniffed deeply. Underneath the absolute disgusting smell of mold and rotting milk, I smelled the peanut butter once more. I ripped open the bag, tearing the sandwich out. I pulled apart the bread and sniffed again. There was peanut butter on Riley's sandwich. 1,000 thoughts ran through my head. Was this someone's idea of a prank? They had swapped my son's lunch for this one? Or perhaps it was merely an accident, and Riley had picked up another student's sandwich instead of his own at the lunch table. I threw the sandwich back into the bin, tears falling freely down my cheeks. One bite of this sandwich had ripped my son away from me. One bite. I went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table. Again, the thought of sending a nasty email to the other parents crossed my mind, but something in my gut told me to wait. I stood up and walked over to the pantry, opening it and grabbing the jar of Wow Butter off the shelf. Was it a manufacturing mistake? No, surely not. The company prided themselves on being 100% nut-free. They wouldn't have even had the chance for any cross-contamination. I set the jar back down on the shelf and sighed. Then, something caught my eye from the back of the top shelf. I moved the boxes of pasta and endless canned goods out of the way. My eyes landed on one fairly full jar of peanut butter. Immediately, I assumed that I had forgotten to throw it out when we cleaned out the kitchen 2 years ago. I pulled it out and looked at it. Only a small amount was taken from the jar. It was all but full. After 2 years, though, it was probably long past its expiration date. That stuff only keeps a few months once open. The expiration date was still a year away, which I thought was weird. I sat back down at my laptop and began to do some research. Peanut butter only lasts a few months before it starts to separate, the oil pooling at the top. Curious, I opened the jar. It was not separated, meaning it had only been recently opened. I could feel my heart in my throat as my mind raced. I looked around the kitchen before my eyes stopped on the nanny cam I had installed a few months earlier. As I pulled up the feed on my phone, my hands shook violently. I almost couldn't type in the password to the app. I hadn't told anyone, not even my husband, about the nanny cam, because I'd actually set it up to see if he was screwing our 19-year-old babysitter. But now, that seemed like the least of my problems. I pulled up the feed for that morning, about when we would have made his lunch, and pressed play. I watched in horror as my husband looked around before walking over to the pantry. He moved all the boxes and cans aside and pulled a fresh jar of peanut butter from the shelf. I watched as he put it on our son's sandwich with the same strawberry jelly we always used. He put the jar back in its hiding spot and made the rest of Riley's lunch without pause. I began hyperventilating and threw up in the kitchen sink. Our son was gone because his father had murdered him. He had planned this all out and then had the nerve to sit in the hospital with me and reassure me that it would be okay. I wondered back to all the times Riley had been hurt in the past. What if my husband was involved in all of it? I turned off the app and placed the jar back in its hiding spot in the pantry. I moved everything back to where it was and put my son's lunchbox back in his bag like I'd never touched it. I sat down on the couch and plotted, waiting for my husband to get home from work. I prepared dinner for him like nothing was wrong. He was relieved to see me in a more upbeat mood that night. I fixed him his favorite dinner, spaghetti and meatballs. Well, I added a personal touch. I am actually a scientist, so I have access to plenty of different chemicals. It was a bit hard to get my hands on them in such a short notice, but I managed to get hold of some cyanide capsules. It wasn't hard to sprinkle them on underneath the Parmesan cheese. We sat down to eat, and I smiled for the first time since my baby boy died. I even laughed as I watched his father begin to choke on his dinner. I continued to eat as my husband grasped for me, blood and vomit pooling in his mouth. He dropped to the floor in convulsions as I finished my last meatball and stood to put my dirty plate in the sink. Finally, his breaths became shallow until he took his last. I decided to watch the rest of the nanny cam footage to find out what else I could before I was inevitably thrown into prison for life. My suspicions turned out to be true. He was screwing the babysitter. Not only that, but it recorded a conversation about 2 weeks earlier between her and my husband. I'm not sure exactly what was said, but I was able to make out a pregnancy test in her hand. I suspect that is why he thought he needed to take this route, and perhaps I would have been next. I may not have been able to protect my son while he was still alive, but I sure as hell was able to get revenge. And that's what being a good mother is all about.